Well, ultimately, every society has to have, like we say, a governing moral vision. They have to have a shared idea that they should be investing in, directing the way they are going to go. We like to think of these neutral institutions. They don't take sides. They don't have a moral viewpoint. But ultimately, that's a lie. Again, as we saw with the pandemic, that's just not the case. And what happened is that throughout our history in the modern era, we have placed a lot of our classic duties as individuals in a culture, in a society, into the hands of the state. We've given up different duties like the ability to raise our children, educate our children, care for the elderly, protect ourselves. These are all things that naturally fell to smaller social spheres: the church, the family, the tribe, the community organization, the labor union. These were all things that bound people together in voluntary and involuntary associations. And each one of these commanded certain duties from us, certain loyalties from us. And the state required those things to exist because it could not handle all of those functions. And that meant that the power of the state was naturally checked by the inability of it to consume all of those different aspects of society. But slowly what has happened is we have built up this capacity through large bureaucratic institutions. The Industrial Revolution, the massive power of scale, has allowed us to go ahead and shift many of those responsibilities into the total state. And that feels liberating, right? That's how we end up with these massive governments, but people still think they're freer than any time in history. That should be those two things should be opposition, right? As the government grows, we should feel that we're restricted. But instead, because we've been handing over these personal responsibilities that used to be owed to these different social spheres, these competing social spheres, to the state, we feel liberated. But what's actually happening is that over time, the competing social spheres that actually check the power of government, not words on paper, not constitutional guarantees, but the actual loyalties to different parts of communities that kept the state from completely consuming this, ended up going away. The kind of liberal idea of the neutral institution allowed us to place so much of what we used to think of as sacred things that we had a duty to perform into the state. And as that occurred, the state consumed all of that power to this point, or to the point now where most people can't even imagine raising and educating their own children without some kind of constant intervention by the state. They can't imagine the idea that they would be responsible for their own physical safety, or that they would care for their neighbor or for the elderly, or that the church itself would handle all of the charity involved in a community. All those ideas are now beyond this. And what it's created is this learned helplessness where the individual in this liberated society really has no other way to have any kind of social architecture, nothing else to fall back on except for the state. And that's why the state now feels like it has the ability to reach into every interaction. It has the ability to mediate every part of our lives, because ultimately we've handed over those individual duties.
I swear this is relevant. Britain has the lowest breastfeeding rate in the world in terms of the proportion of babies that are still being breastfed at like 6 weeks after birth. And a popular narrative as to why this is because the state, i.e. the NHS, the National Health Service, doesn't provide enough breastfeeding support and instruction to new mothers. And I always think about this, like, do you really think that your feudal lord was providing breastfeeding classes, right? Like in a period when it was 100% breastfeeding, right? I mean, obviously That's partly because formula didn't exist and a lot of time babies just died, like a lot of bad outcomes, right? But that's not the crucial factor here. Like the crucial factor, I mean, I think the crucial factor is one, the availability of formula, which just makes it easier. To some extent, corporations having pushed formula in order to make money onto new mums, and also the fact that the extended family has frayed and the community is frayed, and so women having access to informal instruction from other women in their families and their networks has gone. And so the expectation is, well, if the state doesn't perform that function, it simply won't be performed. And to some extent that's true, because when the state encroaches on these areas, the previous provision of these services does wither away. It's like a very It's a very predictable process.
Absolutely. And so I think this is why we've seen the steady growth of government and the comfort with which people will hand over their information, hand over their duties, hand over their liberty, what in the more classical sense, because they feel like ultimately they no longer have the ability to act without an expert. And this is also why our governments have become so unaccountable, because ultimately even the people that we elect don't feel like they're really in charge, especially in the United States. I think a lot of people were shocked to find out during the pandemic that while Donald Trump was president, he was not in charge of the country, that Anthony Fauci was in charge of the country, that the global health organizations, the WHO, were dictating policy, the Gates Foundation, all these unelected massive organizations, these experts were the ones that were really in charge. And I think, again, that was a comforting thought at first when we thought that meant that it saved us from, the caprice of any one ruler. But what we found is actually there's just as much danger in these decentralized systems, these bureaucratic systems, because ultimately that means that no one is held accountable. And they've sucked so much power in that no one knows how to operate without them. They think they have to check an expert at every moment when they want to take any kind of action. But ultimately, there's no one to hold accountable for the decisions that are made.
Peter Turchin, the academic, who is much less, explicitly radical than you or than Cassius Yarvin, is much more sort of sober academic. But he's written just, empirically, straightforwardly, America is a plutocracy. I'm sure that Britain is also a plutocracy, in the sense that whenever there is some difference of opinion between the economic elites and not just the poor, but the middle classes as well. Whenever there's any policy, I mean, sometimes the preferences of the middle and working classes will be the same as those of the economic elites. But whenever they're not, whenever there's a difference, in 100% of cases, it's the economic elites who get their way. So just on that basis, it's just clearly not the case that America is a democracy in a meaningful sense. It's just a fact. It's not a conspiracy. It's just a fact that it's actually governed by a relatively small number of powerful people under the guise of popular democracy.
And I think ultimately this is the problem that has been, that we have had, because the idea that mass democracy would check the power of government, it just doesn't bear out anywhere in history. This is not some weird glitch in the system. This is what happens in democracies. Ultimately, the incentive is always for the ruling class to stay in power. The thing that we lied to ourselves is that we got rid of ruling classes, but that's just not true. There is always an organized elite, and they always lead. I'm not trying to say that to discourage anyone. I'm not even saying that it's immoral. I'm just saying that it's true, in the same way that gravity is real. And so ultimately, there will always be people in charge. And what every ruling class needs is a political formula, a narrative that legitimates their rule. And what we decided in the West is that ultimately that should be based on popular sovereignty. Well, the ruling class is not going to just give up their power because a bunch of people get together and pull a lever somewhere. That would be really stupid. And just that's not going to happen. So what the requirement for mass democracy did, the requirement of that legitimization did, was require the ruling elites to create a mass organization, a mass institutional advantage to manipulate the opinions of the public. So like you said, oftentimes the interests of the lower middle classes will be separate from the upper classes. And maybe if they had control of the operation, the people would go ahead and choose something else. But ultimately, it's the ability of the elites to go ahead and wield the power of especially the press, but also academia, the unelected parts of the executive branch in the United States, which many people call the deep state, and many other organizations like large corporations, censorship through social media, to control information and change the way that things work. And oftentimes, even when we do get very straightforward votes that signal the desire of the voters, the slow manipulation of procedural outcomes through what we call the democratic process means that actually those things never get implemented. And so ultimately, for instance, again, in the United States, We saw that things like gay marriage and transgenderism were not popular just 20 years ago. There were many votes. The public opinion was against them. Everything about democracy says that we shouldn't have gotten the kind of developments we've gotten. And instead, we've raced from, oh, two people should be able to get married, to no, you need to give puberty blockers to 8-year-olds in just inside a little bit over a decade. And clearly that's not because those things are popular, and it's not because it's what voters wanted. It's exactly the opposite of what they wanted. But it's what elite opinion manufactured, and therefore it's what became law, all under what we said was supposed to be a democratic process.